Dr. G. She is an architect and a landscape architect by training. She holds a PhD in design and planning from the University of Colorado, Denver, USA. She has 20 years of teaching and research experience in the fields of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. She has worked in many prestigious institutions including School of Architecture and Planning, Anna University, and College of Architecture and Planning, University of Colorado, Boulder, and Denver. She is currently a professor and a PG program coordinator in the Department of Architecture at Satyabama University. She has been selected as the best graduating student of Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Landscape Architecture program for the year 1994 to 1995. She has also received the B.V. Bhagwat Memorial Award. Apart from all this, she is a fellow member of the Indian Society of Landscape Architects.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series for BArch program. This is the fifth lecture to the course AR 6009 Landscape and Ecology. In this lecture, we will discuss the contents in Unit 3 Garden Design. Unit 3 focuses on landscape and garden design in history. So, in this unit, we will be learning about Japanese gardens, Italian Renaissance gardens, and Mughal gardens in India. In this lecture, we will discuss about Japanese gardens. Under Japanese garden, we will be discussing the historical development of gardens, where we will be discussing about the evolution of characteristics and different concepts of garden design. Then we will discuss about different types of Japanese gardens and the important elements in the Japanese gardens, and then we will look at few examples. Japanese gardens were developed throughout different periods of time. So, the different garden types roughly align with the different historical period, such as Heian period, Kamakura period, Muromachi period, Momoyama period, and Edo period. So, we will look at this development now. Prior to the 6th century AD, Shinto was the indigenous faith of Japan. During that time, the concept of garden was not present. The whole mountain or forest was worshipped. As part of Shintoism, a straw rope or a thread was tied around a rock or tree as a mark of respect for the spirit inhabiting those elements. So, thus the decorated rock or a tree became a place of worship, and often the place around these elements were cleaned and gravel was filled to define the sacred space. The Japanese word for garden, niwa, was first used to denote such sanctified space in nature. So, in effect, nature itself was an object of worship, and the space of worship became gardens. In the second half of the 6th century, art of garden reached from China through Korea to Japan, and also Buddhism also reached at the same time. So, in the Heian period, rich aristocrats built themselves a garden with lakes and islands in their palaces. As this painting denotes, different kinds of recreational activities took place in the garden, such as boating. We can also see pavilions projecting into the water bodies. Such gardens were filled with plum and cherry trees, pines and willows. So, gardens were polychrome, they were very colorful. And during this time, the book on gardening technique was written. The book was known as Sakuteki. None of the gardens that were created during Heian period exist today, but based on the literary descriptions and painting, certain conjunctural reconstruction of the gardens are done. So, in this particular sketch, we can see the palaces, elements such as palaces and subsidiary buildings and pavilions, and these are linked with covered walkways, and these pavilions, some of them are placed near the water bodies or some project into the water body, and there is a huge water body. We can see the source of water as a stream here, and gardens had elements such as islands, and these islands were linked to the mainland through bridges. These are the important elements of Heian period garden. As I said before, none of the Heian period garden exists in right now, but these are some of the remains of the garden of that time. During the between the 13th to 16th century, that is during the Kamakura period and Muromachi period, new form of Buddhism, that is Zen Buddhism, gained prominence, and along with this the art of ink and wash painting also gained importance, and the symbolism of such paintings had a direct influence on garden design. So, this period witnessed the transition from residential lake garden of nobility to Zen minimalism. So, during this period the reductive aesthetics guided the garden design. Stone arrangement gained significance during this period. As an extreme form of minimalism, dry landscape gardens known as Kersansui were developed. As you can see here, in the dry landscape gardens, stone arrangement, moss and sand gravels are used. During this period, the Zen priests became garden designers. So, in Kersansui or dry landscape gardens make symbolic representation of natural landscapes. So, in such gardens, stones, white sand, moss and pruned trees were used, and these were used to symbolically represent nature. For example, the sand which is raked here, you can see the patterns. The sand along with stones are used to represent ocean or a lake with islands. So, in this period gardens continued to become smaller, simpler and more minimalist, and mostly gardens were attached to temple buildings. So, this was done to help monks in meditation and religious advancement. Towards the end of the 16th century, that is, the tea ceremony gained importance. As a result, tea gardens were developed, and tea gardens reached the height of their development during this time, that is towards the end of the 16th century. In the 17th century, during the Edo period, garden design departed from the minimalism. Many of the earlier garden concepts were re-examined and they were brought again into the garden. So, as a result, large strolling gardens with ponds, islands and hills were developed. So, these gardens, that is the kayu, the strolling garden, suggests that this is a landscape in which the observer is in movement. This is in total contrast to the earlier dry landscape garden where it is supposed to help in meditation, whereas in contrast here a landscape is designed in which the observer is in movement. So, here we can see in these gardens different pathways, and along the pathways the nature of the spaces changes, and as a result series of different views are open to the observer. Another concept that is used is shake, which means borrowed landscape. This is the main goal here is to create an illusion of space and landscape continuity. So, in this kind of gardens, the distant elements such as a mountain or distant trees is brought into the garden design. They became part of the garden composition. So, particularly in these type of gardens, the fences were hidden to give a sense of boundless space. In the 19th century, rapid westernization transformed the Japanese gardens. As a result, western garden elements such as flower beds and open lawns were introduced into the Japanese gardens. So, when we looked at the historical development, we came across different kinds of gardens. For example, initially there were landscape gardens with lake and hill, and later with the introduction of Zen Buddhism, with minimalist approach, dry gardens, that is Kersansui, was developed, and later with the prominence of tea ceremony, tea gardens were developed. Then again in contrast to the minimalism, landscape gardens, stroll gardens were developed. So, now we will look at the different types of gardens. There are different classification system again for the type of garden, Japanese gardens. There are up to 7 or 8 types of gardens, but there is a lot of overlap. So, we will discuss about the basic 3 types of gardens, that is the landscape garden with hill and lake, the level garden and the tea garden. We will start with the landscape garden with the hill and lake. In this kind of gardens, if the lake is really large, then an island is placed in the middle and then it is connected to the mainland through the bridges. Generally, such lakes were irregular in shape and part of the edges were hidden as part of the design element. Sometimes the stream serves as an important feature of the landscape. So, such landscape gardens form the basis of Japanese garden. The second type of garden is the level garden or the symbolic level garden. So, they appeared as gardens of the Zen temple. This type of garden reproduces nature in symbolic and abstract way. This was designed as an aid to meditation. So, these kind of gardens were enclosed within the walls and relationship of the viewer to the garden was fixed, and rocks or small heaps of sand were used to symbolically represent mountain tops, and water was represented around these using white sand or gravel. The third type of garden is the tea garden. Tea garden became an important element of Japanese gardens because tea ceremony gained importance towards the end of the 16th century. So, a Japanese who is interested in a tea ceremony will build himself a tea room in the house or a separate tea pavilion in the garden. So, tea gardens are highly functional gardens. So, they had functional elements such as stone water basin, stepping stones and stone lanterns. You can see the images here, a stone water basin and stepping stones. These are highly functional elements. The stepping stones protect the moss covered surface of the garden, and the stone water basin provide water to the visitor so that they can rinse their hands before starting the tea ceremony. Tea gardens were initially single undivided garden. There was a tea pavilion and there were stepping stones with stone water basin arrangement, but later as this tea ceremony got stabilized, they were separated into inner and outer garden. This is the tea pavilion. So, this is the inner garden and there is an outer garden. These two gardens were separated by a fence or hedge with a gate. So, this is the outer garden. In general, the outer garden had a gateway or a gate, and then there were waiting lodges and waiting benches in the outer gardens. Then there were stepping stones that led the guest into the inner garden. We can see the stepping stones and the fence and the gate here. This is a view of another typical tea garden, where we can see inner garden is separated by a hedge and a gate, and we can also see stepping stone leading to the inner garden from the outer garden. Once the guests come to the inner garden, they see a stone water basin arrangement. Here there is a stone water basin and also a stone lantern. These are all functional elements. So, before entering the garden, they rinse their hands. In the inner garden, we again have another waiting lodge or waiting bench. So, here is a view of the waiting lodge and the tea pavilion. So, the mark of the beginning of the tea ceremony is marked by sound of the bell, and at that point the guests come out and he receives the guest from the waiting bench. Here is another view where we can see a close up of the stone lantern and stepping stones and a tea pavilion. So, those are the three types of gardens. Next, we will discuss about different garden elements that are found in the Japanese garden. They are stone, arrangement of stones, stepping stones and step stones, stone water basin, stone lantern, fences, vegetation, water and garden bridges. Garden stones are important. So, the stones in Japanese garden. So, stones arranged in groups, as you can see here in this view, they are the most important features of the Japanese garden. Few garden designers go to the extent of saying that the stone arrangement is like a skeleton of the Japanese garden. And there are specific rules related to the selection of the stones, and importance was given to the proportion and scale of the stones. There were 5 radical shapes. They are statue stone. As the name implies, this kind of stone resembles a human figure. It is a tall vertical stone which bulges in the middle and then it ends conically on top. Another basic shape is a low vertical stone. This is rounded at the base and again it is conical on top. The third shape is a flat stone. This is much higher than a stepping stone, but it is flat on top. And the fourth type is an arching stone. Here it has a flat top, but it bends towards one side and it forms an arch. The fifth basic shape is the recumbent ox stone. It got its name because it resembles a resting animal. So, this is higher on one side, it is curved, and it is lower on the other side. So, the flat stone and the recumbent ox stone are considered as horizontal stones, whereas the other three are considered as vertical stones. And all these stones are placed in the gardens with there are specific rules related to it. For example, in a typical stone arrangement, first a main stone is placed to the left of the central axis, and in front of it another subsidiary stone is placed, and just diagonally opposite to it another opposing stone is placed. These two stones, that is the main stone and opposing stones, are always they always have contrasting characteristics. This is the basic arrangement. With this, two or more complementary stones can be added in the foreground and in the background. Mirror image of similar arrangement can also be used. So, the main idea behind the stone arrangement is to make them appear as if natural forces have placed them in this position. Another element that we find in all Japanese garden is the stepping stones. These stepping stones have both functional and artistic significance. These were mainly derived from the tea ceremony to preserve the moss covered surface of the gardens. Generally, flat natural stones are used. Though the arrangement appears accidental and unplanned, in reality there were definite rules that govern the placement of these stepping stones. The basic number was 6, as you can see here. There were basic numbers of 6 stepping stones were laid, and to this 4 further ones could be added. These are the different possible stepping stone arrangements. Wherever the path divides, a large natural stone is placed. Here are some examples. So, the junction of the path is marked by a large natural stone, and when the path is too long, to prevent the monotony, rectangular stones are added in the as part of the stepping stones. We also find step stones in the gardens. They lead to the stepping stones. They are placed, a large hewn stone or a natural stone is placed just next to the veranda. So, a person coming from the garden places the shoe on this garden. Next to it, there are also 2 smaller stones are placed. They are known as second and third step stones. Mainly, they form the transition to the stepping stone path from the veranda, as we can see here. Step stones and secondary stones, and there is a main stepping stone pathway here. Another important element that we find in Japanese garden is the stone water basin. There are 2 kinds of stone water basins. One is a low stone water basin, the other one is a high stone water basin. Generally, yes, large stepping stone is provided at the rear so that water can be replenished in this basin. Sometimes water is carried through bamboo pipes. We can also see bamboo scoops that help in using the water. Stone water basins are made of natural or lightly worked stones. We can see different kinds of stone water basins here. The next element, Japanese garden element, is the stone lantern. A typical stone lantern is made up of 5 components, that is the base, the pedestal, the capital, the light holder, and the headpiece. And a step stone is generally placed behind the lantern so that the lantern can be, it helps in lighting the lantern. Stone lanterns are generally placed near stone water basin or where 2 paths cross, or on the banks of the lake, or in the middle of the shrubbery. But all stone lanterns do not have the basic 5 components. Stone lantern design evolved, and we can see different kinds of stone lanterns here. In some cases, the base is missing, or the pedestal is missing, or it is modified into different form. Here we can see a different design of stone lantern. Garden fences became an important element after the introduction of the tea ceremony. There are 3 kinds of garden fences. One is a short fence, and the second is the inner fence, and the third one is the outer fence. This shows both short fence and the inner fence. What we see here is the short fence. This is generally 3 by 5 feet in dimension. Short fence is like a small outer wall extending directly from the house into the garden. They are made with bamboo or rushes or slender branches of clover and other similar plants. They have both artistic importance and practical purposes. They form a background to the water basin layout at times, and practically they screen the view into the house. The second type of fence is the inner fence. This encloses the inner tea garden, and here what we see here in this case, the fence is made of bamboo. Outer fence has different characteristics in different types of gardens. For example, in landscape garden, the aim is to make the garden seem boundless. So, in such cases the outer fence is hidden by plants and the garden appears to extend without any limit. Whereas, in case of level gardens, this outer fence forms a background to the garden elements in the garden. Vegetation again is another important element. Till the 10th and 12th century, the gardens were very colorful. We saw the garden paintings during the Heian period. They contained ornamental flowering shrubs, cherry and plum trees. But with the introduction of the Zen Buddhism, flowering trees were considered as a sign of frivolity. As a result, evergreen trees were used or planted in the gardens. We can find trees such as pine trees in the Japanese gardens during that time. So, evergreen trees represent eternity. But later towards the end of the 17th century, flowering trees were introduced, but trees with light colored blossoms were mainly preferred, such as plum trees. We also find flowering shrubs with evergreen leaves such as camellia and azalea. There are also flowering grasses in the garden. Moss is an important part of the Japanese garden. As the images show here, we can see the moss, and ferns are also another important vegetation plant type used in Japanese gardens. The next important element is water. We can say that this is an indispensable feature of Japanese garden. We can find water in the form of lakes, streams or cascades in Japanese garden. In case of lakes, the complete outline is not visible. It is purposely hidden to indicate an undefined extent, but the source of water such as stream or a waterfall is made prominent in the design. Or even when the water is not used in the garden, the idea of water scenery is expressed by the arrangement of stones, sand and plants. This is dry landscape gardens. We already looked at the concept. So, in this case, a sand with certain stones are used here to represent the lake or sea with islands or rocks jutting out. Here we see a meandering bed spread with pebbles or sand. So, they convey an impression of a stream, and this is strengthened by using small bridges, as we can see here, and water related plants and round river boulders along the banks. So, since water is an important element, garden bridges also become an important element in Japanese garden. Garden bridges were constructed with different materials. We can find stone bridges, earth bridges and wooden bridges in Japanese gardens. We can find both flat and arched bridges in Japanese gardens. Earth bridges are basically wooden bridges, but then they are covered with earth. For aesthetic purpose, generally at the end of the bridges, we can find a stone or a shrub, as we can see here. And most of these bridges, or none of these bridges, have railings. Here we see a wooden bridge and earthen bridge, that is a wooden bridge covered with earth. So, those are the important elements of Japanese garden. Now, we will look at two examples for Japanese garden. We will look at example for a dry landscape garden, that is a Zen garden at Ryoanji temple first. Here is a view of the Ryoanji temple garden. It is a small enclosed inward looking garden. It is part of a Zen temple. It is approached and viewed from the veranda of a temple. The enclosure measures 70 feet by 30 feet. It contains 15 stones in 5 uneven groups from left to right. We can see 5, 3, 3, 2 and 3 stones here. And it is said that from the veranda, when we view, always at least one stone is hidden from the view. So, here is a view of the stone groups. We can see the forest that is beyond the boundary, and these stones are set in coarse sand. They are raked in patterns. This is part of the Zen practice. So, they are the sand is raked in circular patterns around the stone and in straight lines in other places. So, one of the important characteristics of water is its mobility. So, these sand is raked in patterns, and the wind wipe out these traces of this, and as a result they attempt to capture the transient quality of the water in the sand raking patterns. We can see the enclosing wall. This is 7 feet high and it has a tile roof on top. We can see the plants beyond the enclosing wall, and the entire arrangement is we can see it is bounded by stones. So, this is a close up view of the raked sand, pebbles and the veranda of the garden, and the only vegetation in the garden is a moss around the stones. So, this Rayonji garden it is a perfect setting for contemplation. The next example that we are going to see is the Katsura Imperial Villa. The garden in Katsura Imperial Villa was built during the Edo period, and it was built as a countryside retreat for Prince Toshihiko Hito. This garden design blends the elegance of Heian era and the rustic simplicity of the tea culture, and this garden has 2 ancient symbols of longevity in the landform. There is a tortoise shaped island that is set in a flying crane shaped lake, and there are a series of tea houses in the garden, and the stepping stone paths link all these tea pavilions. A path of 1760 stones make these stone pathways, and the observer always moves in a clockwise direction, and the lake is always to the right of the observer. Here we see the 3-dimensional view. We can see the palace and the different tea gardens, tea pavilions and the stone pathways. This black and white image shows the tortoise shaped island and the flying crane shaped lake. This shows the configuration of the building and the relationship to the garden elements. We can see the buildings and the different garden bridges and the stone arrangements. Now, this is overlaid with vegetation. This is the entire view of the garden, another view, and as the observer moves along the pathway, the different carefully composed views are revealed to the observer. As we see here, this is the initial view of the tea garden, another view of the island, and here is the view of the palace from the tea pavilion, view of the islands, a view of the earthen bridge and the temple. And the observer, when they come to the palace, there is a stone viewing platform. Here are some of the structures in the garden gates, garden bridges, different kind of stepping stones. These paths sequentially present the garden views and objects to the visitor, and plants are carefully placed so that it is impossible for a visitor to view the entire garden from one place. Here are some of the carefully composed view of the Katsura Imperial Palace. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. So, in this lecture we discussed about Japanese gardens. We started with historical development of Japanese gardens, and we discussed about the development of different characteristics and the concepts. We discussed about the concepts such as kayu, kersansui and shake, and then we looked at 3 different types of Japanese gardens: the landscape garden with hill and lake, and the level garden and the tea gardens. Then we discussed about the different Japanese garden elements, starting from stone arrangement, ending with stone bridges. and we looked at two examples. One is a Zen garden at Ryonji temple, the other one is a garden at Katsura Imperial Villa. With this, you should be able to answer the following questions. Briefly explain the concept of borrowed landscape. Write a short note on Karsan Sui. Write a short note on stone arrangements in Japanese gardens. What are the different types of Japanese gardens? Explain the various concepts and elements that contribute to the uniqueness of a typical Japanese garden. Thank you.